A priest stumbles across an otherworldly trap. The tiniest bystander feels the rain from a most unlikely storm. The natural world grieves alongside a lonely father. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. The evening was coming to a close, and Father Witherow was finished with his last Monday tasks at the church. Mondays were some of his easier days and allowed for more rest in the evening. He usually spent this time on one of his several hobbies, such as wood carving, building model airplanes, or painting. Lately, however, he was having a hard time focusing on these pastimes, but the evening would certainly provide him more time to think. Time that he now found he needed. After his conversation with the dead man the night before, he hadn't been able to put his mind into anything else at all. He was changing into his more casual attire, jeans and a black shirt. His neat stack of what he considered his pocket things was sitting on the edge of the table next to him. He never failed to keep these items in strict order. He had done this since he was a teenager. His wallet always made the foundation of the pile. It was thin and made of real leather. He was never the kind of man that let his wallet get unruly, fat, and bursting at the seams. It had lasted him a long time, and its use showed around its edges. One of the only extra items he would keep within it were his sobriety anniversary medallions, his most recent acknowledging 15 years of being sober. On top of this was a tube of chapstick, and around that was a steel, oval-shaped carabiner whose patina also showed its age. Since his early 20s, he had worn this carabiner on his right hip around a belt loop, or would carry it in his right front pocket if he didn't have anywhere to hang it. It was a gift from his closest friend, and keeping it on his person made him feel that they were always at his side. He would sometimes lock his thumb in the loop when he most needed to remember this friendship, and the guidance, strength, trust, and love that went with it. Next to the wallet were his small ring of keys and a Remington Guide pocket knife. This knife had been given to him by his father when he was 11 years old. He had taken very good care of it, kept it sharp, and used it frequently for small utility tasks, such as opening boxes or for whittling pieces of wood, as he thought. These things he almost always made sure he had with him. He became anxious if any one of them were missing. He placed his things into their proper locations, keys in the left front pocket, the wallet and chapstick opposite of that, the knife in his back right pocket, and finally the carabiner on his right side belt loop. He walked out through the back door of the church and before leaving sat down on the steps outside of the door. He hadn't been able to get the conversation from the night before out of his head.
We felt them steal the body of a young girl. They will give her no proper rest. There is a woman who steals the peace of her husband and forces him to remain among the living.
What did it all mean? How literal was he to take these hints? He didn't believe that he alone would be able to make the forces from the forest stop. He didn't yet know what they were or what was their origin, but he did believe he knew where he would start. Disappearances had occurred in the community, and that could mean restless dead in this case. He had been thinking that looking into these or searching for some kind of lead was within even his grasp. Thoughts of Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep crossed his mind as he pondered the idea. He gave a short chuckle as he cast himself in the role of a detective. He could chase down leads on anyone that had disappeared. He would have to buy a trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The cartoonish thought of detectives brought his wandering mind to the black suit-wearing men the Lich had brought up the night before, and that he had been seeing all over the neighborhood since the spring. Those same men the dead man described as having taken the body of a young girl. Maybe if he talked to one of these men while they were alone, he could start to track down some answers. But how would a conversation like that even start? As he sat there, he began to tie the yarns together between another one of the Lich's statements and something that had already troubled him occasionally over the last year. His parish was small, and he knew nearly all of the parishioners well. He had been there for them through many happy or trying times: baptisms, weddings, counseling, illnesses, funerals. A priest in a smaller community finds their way into many aspects of the church members' lives, whether they attend regularly or not. One such couple that he knew well, though they were what some people called Christmas and Easter Catholics, had suddenly dropped out of his life nearly a year ago. Marjorie had still come to Mass off and on for a month or two after the last time he remembered seeing Walt. But then she had stopped too. He had concerns about their home life for some time. He worried that Walt might abuse his wife and their son. The way he spoke to her, the way their son Greg would cower around him. It always made Father Witherow uneasy. Partly because of this, he watched for signs and would check in on the family from time to time. 3 times the previous year he had dropped by their home since they had stopped coming to church. Marjorie had answered the door each time. She seemed very hesitant to speak with him and uncomfortable that he was even around. She assured him that everything was okay and would hurry the conversation to its close. She had looked healthier on these brief visits. Healthier and more confident somehow, but anxious. When he'd stopped a couple times after this, no one answered the door. After that, he'd stopped visiting. He knew they still lived in the neighborhood. He had seen Marjorie driving occasionally and once at the grocery store. It had struck him as odd the way they left the church and how she seemed to shut him and everyone else out. But until last night and today, he hadn't realized that he couldn't remember the last time he had seen Walter. Father Witherow had always been somewhat leery of the man, and he guessed that he was just pleased to a degree that Walter wasn't around anymore. He wasn't fond of Walter, so he didn't ask about him when he had checked in on Marjorie. The thought hadn't occurred to him. Now, however, coupled with the deeds described in last night's discussion, suspicions suddenly bloomed like a bright red rose in his mind.
There is a woman who steals the peace of her husband and forces him to remain among the living.
Marjorie's anxiety, the lack of seeing Walt in any way for nearly a year, no word of an illness or death or divorce. Could it be? He thought it was at least a place to start. They lived down the street on the other side of Hidden Oaks Park. It wasn't too late in the evening yet. Father Witherow could take a short detour down their street on his walk home and just try to stop by and check in again. This time it was simple. He would ask how Walt was doing, or if he could speak with him even, and feel out the response. It felt like a good first step. He rose from his seat on the stairs and began to make his way home. The evening was quiet. There were soft sounds of the light traffic on nearby streets. The frogs and crickets had begun their songs, and there was the rhythmic clacking of his boot heels on the pavement as he walked. He thought of the night prayer from the Liturgy of the Hours that he usually said before going to sleep. Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep, that awake we may keep watch with Christ, and asleep rest in his peace. Amen, he whispered out loud. As he turned the corner and walked down the street, he was deafened by the sudden absence of the sounds that were previously with him. He paused mid-stride as this struck him. The frogs and crickets, his boots, the traffic. It was all just gone. Or at least, if he listened very hard, muffled in the extreme. As he stood there, he also noticed a murky pond scum smell that he hadn't until now. He continued to walk, unable to ignore the fact that his usually quite prominent steps made little to no sound. He walked up Walter and Marjorie's driveway. The lights were on in the house, and he saw a shadow movement on the living room curtains, indicating that someone was home and awake. He paused before stepping up to the door. A new smell greeted his nose as he did. Another eerie feeling crept over him. The smell of fresh-cut grass and a recent fire. Only, it wasn't quite right. There was another odor about it that wasn't exactly pleasant, which he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't the pond water smell either. It was something altogether different. He stepped to the front door, raised his hand, and knocked 3 times. Even the sound of his knock was wrong. It was distant, obscured somehow in an undefinable way. Father Witherow pinched his nose and blew without opening his mouth to try and unblock his ears. They squeaked and popped, and he swallowed hard to clear them. He closed his eyes and leaned his head toward the door to hear if he could discern the sound of footsteps approaching the door. This time he did hear something. A muffled, single thud, then silence again. He waited. Then his ears were greeted with a soft and distant shuffling, followed by another thud. He began to feel an alarm raise in him, deep in his core. He had worried about domestic abuse in this home for some time, and maybe he had come face to face with that fear tonight. He raised his hand again, this time pounding on the door with his fist rapidly 5 times, each knock rattling it in its frame. This time the pounding was more easily heard. He listened again, and heard even more clearly a woman's voice cry out, "Help!" Tim felt the rush of adrenaline in a cold wave down his spine and into his extremities. His gut twisted instantly into a queasy knot. He barely hesitated. He grasped the handle and turned. The door was unlocked, and he opened it. He stepped across the threshold and began to say, "Hello, is everything okay?" But he could barely get the first syllable out of his mouth before several things rushed to his attention, screaming to be noticed by his senses. "Help me!" was screamed out again by a woman's voice in utter panic from the upper level. It was clearly shouted, but again dampened in that same way that all sound down this street seemed to be. His eyes shot straight to the top of the stairs, where obvious signs of a struggle greeted him. A bathrobe lay hanging over the top step. Framed photographs had tumbled off the wall, and the few that remained were hanging at odd angles, and just below them, a bright red streak. This tied directly into the next thing that Father Witherow noticed: the sharp, metallic smell of blood. The door slammed shut behind him, and he didn't even notice. Not bothering to remove his boots at the door, the priest bounded up the stairs, taking them 2 by 2. When he reached the top, he looked to his right, and in no way was he ready for what he saw. Marjorie, completely naked, was lying on the floor, covered in blood. She appeared to be alone. It took only a second to see that she was strained to the utmost, trying to scramble away from the fireplace. Long marks from fingers trying to grasp into the carpet, coupled with more bloody streaks. She was half on her side, and she looked up at him, her plea for help desperate in her eyes. Then Father Witherow's eyes noticed the blood was not only on Marjorie and the floor. Some of it was suspended in the air, tracing out from her neck and each of her limbs. He followed these crimson, glistening lines to their destination, the fireplace. Here, he was greeted with a new terror. An utterly terrible double row of round teeth that were like lined headstones where the bloody lines ended. After taking this scene in for what felt like 5 minutes, but couldn't have been more than a half second, Tim acted without a second thought. He dropped to the floor and grabbed Marjorie under the armpits with both arms. He was able to start pulling her back to the edge of the stairs. Whatever struggle had been going on, the two who were wrapped up in the fight must have taken a brief break when he had entered the scene. This momentary cessation did not last long. He landed back on his butt at the top of the stairs with Marjorie nearly in his lap, his arms wrapped around her armpits and up, locking her shoulders in his grasp. Then he braced the two of them with his foot on the wall leading down the stairs. Just then he heard a guttural, almost demoniac laugh, but it wasn't in his ears, as much as it swam through his mind. Then he felt the lines that were binding Marjorie go taut and start pulling the both of them back toward the fireplace. He increased the counter-pressure on his leg as the thing began to pull. He heard the laugh in his head again, and then Marjorie took a hard lurch that he was barely ready to brace against. Marjorie screamed. It was clear that the cords or wires or whatever these things were that were snared around her were biting into her skin. They must be causing intense pain, and worse, they were both sweaty and covered in blood, and as the thing pulled harder, he could feel Marjorie start to slip through his grasp. He had to cut the strings. He wrapped his right arm around her chest so that he could hold her beneath both arms while using his left hand to pull out his pocket knife. It was the only thing he could think of to use. He could not risk letting her go to get something better. He fished it out of his pocket and was able to bring it to his other hand to pull the blade open. Through all of this, Marjorie had begun howling in pain. No words, just alternating between screaming and moaning. Another jolt pulling on them both made Marjorie cry out, and Father Witherow glanced back up at the smiling mouth in the fireplace. It had now begun to open, and there was a pair of white gleaming eyes beset above the yawning maw.
"I'm gonna get you out of this," said the priest through clenched teeth. "But I need you to try and hold still while I do."
He reached around in front of her face with his left hand and quickly placed the blade of the knife under the wire that was coming from her throat. He tried to saw, but there was enough slack in the line that it wiggled a little as he did this. That wasn't going to work. He braced hard with his foot and pulled Marjorie back to put as much tension as he could on the lines. Then, in a hard and fast upward motion, he pushed and slashed with the knife. At the same time, and to his surprise, there was the loud twanging of a taut steel cable being snapped. He saw the bloody line snake away as it reeled up into the mouth of the thing. For a moment, all was silent again. The tension on the lines slackened briefly. Acting swiftly, the priest pulled backward again, this time slashing at the cord coming from Marjorie's right arm. Again, the wire snapped and slithered toward the mouth. He heard a different sound this time, one that he would never be able to really describe. It was like the drain leading to an abyss was pulled and reality was being sucked inside of its immense vacuum. Then the efforts of the thing tripled. It no longer pulled in a steady increasing pressure. It started to give frantic, shocking jerks that began to wrench the woman away from him. He started to lose his grip, and in order to regain it, he had to pull his foot up from the sidewall of the stairs. The two of them lost a few feet of ground as they were dragged toward the fireplace and the wide-open grin of teeth therein. "Grab the railing! Help me if you can!" the priest shouted. Marjorie did what she could with her right arm, grasping the wrought iron railing. She was clearly losing any strength she had left. She wouldn't be able to help him for long. The loss of blood, having fought this thing for how long already? She couldn't help with her left arm because it was still being pulled downward into the waiting jaws of the thing. Father Witherow had to act quickly. Whatever short time he already had was running out for the both of them. He was going to have to let her go at least for a second to get to the other cords. He scooted himself off to the left side of her and then, letting her go, flung himself forward and grasped the line that was on her other arm. It was wet with blood and cold, but it also had a slight pulsing or buzzing resonance along it. He pulled it to the side away from Marjorie and dug his knife into this as well. As it was cut, it slashed through the hand he held it with, slicing into his palm and sending a stinging electrical pain up his arm which dug into his shoulder. He was startled by this feeling and distracted just long enough to watch as Marjorie's grasp slipped on the railing. She gave out a whimpering cry and began to drag across the floor toward the mouth. He was surprised she wasn't dragged faster, though it would still only be a matter of seconds before she reached the terror. Marjorie flailed out at everything she passed, the stout legs of the couch and the coffee table. Father Witherow plunged forward and dove toward the woman, landing half on top of her, his head facing the fireplace. He pulled back onto his knees, kneeling mostly on the woman to try to hold her down from being dragged further. It didn't work. The two of them slowly began to be dragged again. He leaned forward and was able to slice through the cord coming from her left leg. The laugh returned to his mind, and the demonic jaws widened to nearly the entire height of the fireplace as Marjorie's legs began to enter them. He grabbed her by the left leg and arm, trying to stand up and pull her away from the teeth. Her right leg entered the mouth with a jerk, and the two of them fell back. Father Witherow sprawled on his back as he heard the sickening crunch followed by the most panicked, real, and blood-curdling scream he could ever remember. He sat up, and all he saw was Marjorie lying in front of him, blood oozing from her various cuts, and a steadier pulsing stream from the stump where her right leg had been severed just above the knee. Marjorie sobbed and cried out continuously, but said no words that could be made out coherently. The mouth was gone. He could see the fire brick and the andirons where it had been, and he could hear the mental laugh and the scurrying up the chimney as it fled. Blood was dripping down and splashing on the fireplace floor. He looked to his left. High on the wall inside the kitchen was a telephone. "It's going to be all right, Marjorie. I'm going to call for help." He dragged her a couple feet from the fireplace and quickly grabbed the phone, dialing 911 as he returned to her side. He had to stop the bleeding on her stump. He put his knee on the center of her thigh several inches up from where it suddenly ended. where a few minutes before there had been a full leg. He knelt down, placing all the weight he could onto that spot. Marjorie shouted and then appeared to pass out. The blood also appeared to slow. Then, over the receiver, he heard, "911 dispatch, please state the nature of your emergency." It felt like the police had arrived in about 20 seconds. That isn't usually how things like this happened. Generally, situations like this dragged out and felt like an eternity. That had been nearly 30 minutes ago now. Marjorie was long gone, taken away by the paramedics. Father Witherow was sitting at the kitchen table with a police officer, finishing up providing his statement of the situation. That's what the man had told him he was, anyway. The priest wasn't used to seeing police officers that wore cheap black suits on their daily beat. He was very calm and calming. He handled the situation solemnly and professionally, and helped the priest feel as much at ease as he was able. That wasn't the only strange thing, though. The paramedics that had also arrived in less than a minute were wearing the kind of jumpsuits that you would expect a fighter pilot or a mechanic to wear. He had never seen any paramedics with uniforms like that before. But they took care of Marjorie. They had put 2 tourniquets around her leg to stop the bleeding, and had begun to dress some of the other wounds. Then they loaded her on a stretcher and removed her from her home. As he had told his story to the officer, he kept looking at his pocket knife, which was sitting on the kitchen table. The blade was jagged and burned. Big chunks of it had been removed, the way the jaws of a lineman's pliers look after cutting through and shorting out a live electrical wire. Father Witherow was in a daze. 40 minutes ago, he'd been walking down the street to check in on a family he had concerns about. Now, he had fought against something he couldn't explain that was trying to eat the woman he had come to visit. She had lost a leg, and who knew whether she would live or die from her injuries. The police and paramedics that had shown up hardly looked the part, and didn't even bat an eye when he explained the story exactly as it had happened. The man in the suit with him in the kitchen had just asked him if he had anything else to add when another called out to him as he came up the stairs. "Agent Ousting, you wouldn't believe it! There's a burned-up corpse in the backyard. Might be the husband. Must have just He cut himself short as he reached the top of the steps. He locked eyes with the priest, and they stared at one another. He was clearly surprised that this man was still there, and looked very much embarrassed at his lack of caution. The man at the table with Father Witherow glared at the younger man who was in an identical suit. A tense moment passed, and the younger man joined the two in the kitchen. The priest knew none of this was right. He was sure these weren't the police, but bizarre puzzle pieces were coming together very quickly all around him. They also didn't seem to be a threat, so again, just as before, he made the decision to listen, wait, and observe. "This is Father Tim Witherow. Father, this is my partner, Officer Wilker. I apologize for his excitement and rude behavior, but he's new to the force. I hope you can forgive him," said the one called Ousting, while not looking away from Wilker or blinking his eyes. The two exchanged a brief greeting and a handshake. "Well, Father, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I think we have some work to do, and we can let you be on your way." If Marjorie doesn't pull through, or if what I just heard you found out back is true, please let whoever needs to know, we will hold services for them at the church. You can find me there if you need anything, but other than that, I don't, and honestly, I think I just need to lie down. I really don't feel very well. You've been through a lot tonight. That's understandable. If anything else comes to mind, or especially if anything else strange goes on, feel free to give us a jingle directly. He handed Tim a card that said Detective Ousting, and had 2 phone numbers on it and nothing more. The top one's my pager, the other is the office. Someone's always there to take the call, continued the detective. Thank you, I will. Father Witherow rose, followed by the man who the young officer had called Agent Ousting. After steadying himself on legs that felt like jello, he shook the 2 men's hands and left the house. He never had gotten a chance to do what he had come here for, and he felt like he was leaving with dozens more questions, not to mention trauma as well. He felt dazed, but as he walked outside into the warm summer night, a clarity began to seep into his mind. There were no squad cars in the driveway. Just a single black Mercury sedan with no light rack, no strobes, no police license plates. Who were these people? They mentioned a corpse. Could it have been Walter? Could it be true that Marjorie was the woman the Lich had spoken of? Could she have kept her dead husband around for months? Maybe a year? The prospect was nearly more horrifying than the fight he had just endured. For one thing, why would anyone want to keep Walter around longer than they needed to? Father Witherow gave a long sigh. His right thumb found its way into the loop of the carabiner on his hip. Then, thinking about what to do next and on unsteady legs, he made the slow walk home. He woke up sharply, with a feeling that something was not quite right. In his groggy morning wakefulness, he wasn't able to put his senses on exactly what it was that was off. He went through his short wake-up routine, fixing his hair and washing his face before going out for his breakfast. He still had that sense that something was odd, and when he poked his head out of his front door and gazed into the large front room of the People House, the mouse was finally able to put his whiskers on it. He knew it was night. He always came out at night. But here, suddenly, in the People Room, it was a bright, hot summer day. He felt the warmth from the sun accompanied by a gentle, cool breeze on his face. He could smell the grasses and prairie flowers. He could hear the sound of rippling water. When he looked around, he saw that all of these things seemed to be spilling forth from a picture on the other side of the big room. Several days ago, the people that lived here had put the large new painting high on the wall across from the mouse's front door. It was quite simple. A smoothly rolling meadow of prairie grasses and flowers, a winding stream crossed by a big stone bridge, and a big yellow sun in a big blue sky. The mouse didn't know its purpose, but he did recognize the image of an outside landscape. He hadn't lived in people houses his whole life. He had been outdoors. He had seen the big sky, meadows, forests, and even a stream once. He started living in people houses because it was warmer, easier to find good food, and less things tried to get him in here. This house had been his favorite so far. These people didn't have a cat or a dog, or any animals living with them, so there wasn't anything here that would try to chase him. Even better than that, at regular intervals these people would leave for multiple days, and he didn't even have to be careful when he went out to get his food. In fact, the people were gone tonight. He wouldn't have to be as cautious. But this new discovery still gave him pause. One doesn't live to be an old mouse without caution. So he sat still for a few minutes, gazing out into the big room, watching and waiting. He looked mostly at the picture. He could see the grass move in the same breeze that ruffled the fur on his head. He could see little ripples in the water as it flowed down the stream. He could see dark clouds in the distance, slowly rolling closer across the plain. The whole scene reminded him of the way the television on a table in the corner of the room affected things. He thought of this as the light and noise box. It showed pictures and produced light too, but never had he been able to feel or smell the things that were in there. After a time, he decided it was safe to try coming out and heading to the food place. The effects of the painting were still present after he left the big room, but they were dulled somewhat once he reached the kitchen. He began to put this in the back of his mind and relax his caution. He scurried up into the cupboards and set to work gathering his meal. A little while later, after significant rummaging through the various delicacies the people had stashed away, he slowed his pace as he perceived another change about him. He heard a distant and rhythmic pattering. It was gentle at first and was very easy to lose in the sound of the crinkling bags of his favorite crackers. But as its volume increased and became steadier, he paused, lifted his head out of a box, and listened. The sound was hollow and all around him. It was coming from outside the cabinets. He had eaten enough for now, and all these changes were making him uneasy enough that he felt it was a good idea to go out and investigate his surroundings. He squeezed out through a narrowly open cupboard door and dropped to the floor. He scampered along the length of the cupboards beneath their overhang where he would always try to stay out of sight. He made the turn in the corner and quickly scurried to the last edge of the overhang. There was the fresh scent of ozone, what the mouse's mind related to summer thunderstorms. It was fresh, yet slightly earthy. He peeked his head out and quickly noticed there was water falling down from the ceiling. He had never seen anything like that inside before. The rain was light, but by the smells and an innate intuition, he knew that it would be getting stronger soon. He ran back to the living room. Here, the rain was a lot heavier already, and again, all the senses were much stronger. He looked up at the picture, which had changed greatly. The blue sky had been covered by big, dark storm clouds. He could see in the near distance that the rain was coming down very heavily, and the wind was blowing strongly. He was startled abruptly by a great flash, followed by a peal of thunder. He jumped and immediately ran inside his front door. After a brief moment, he felt something new within his mind as the storm in the big room continued outside. It wasn't words or language, but the mouse did feel called back to the front door of his home. He looked out and up and again at the picture. Here he saw a dark shape moving toward him from beneath the bridge. It called to his mind. It told him that it wasn't safe to keep living with the people anymore. It told him he would be better to return to nature where he would be taken care of and wouldn't be chased any longer. It told him the time to leave was now. He trusted the shadows and the thoughts. They made him feel calm. They did not make him feel afraid. He didn't have anything to bring with him. Mice don't have belongings. He simply squished out under the front door of the people house and into a warm, clear summer night. No rain, no prairie, no stream, no sun when it should be dark. He could still hear the thunderstorm raging inside the house behind him. He looked ahead, down the driveway and across the street. On the edge of the forest, the mouse watched as a cat with white eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness emerged from the forest and sat down. He could feel it watching him, but again he did not feel afraid. He had the same feeling of communication in his mind again without words. In his mind, the cat beckoned him to come and join the forest, where he could live and be safe. He walked in scampery bursts down the driveway, several feet, then stop. Several more, then stop. He crossed the road, and now, more slowly, approached the cat and the edge of the woods. He felt the calm renew in his mind. He felt that he didn't need to be as cautious here. The forest loved him. The cat turned and walked back into the underbrush, and the mouse followed. The earwigs could not go back to life as normal. The forest, their home for thousands of generations, was now occupied, rearranged, and blooming into an abomination that the surrounding natural world had never witnessed. They thought if they assisted with this force, with her, they would be spared any aggression towards their realm. This was not the case. This level of villainy was violent to their very souls, as small and as primitive as they might be. They had helped her murder the girl and take her arm, for whatever reason she had. From what they could see from the branches and shadows, it was for nothing. The island was quiet. There was no movement after the killing. It was like no favor was completed. The earwigs did try to go back to normal. It had been 5 days since Aubrey's death. They fed on aphids and mites in the undergrowth, explored trails of leaves, dodged raindrops from summer showers, and sucked lichen off rocks nestled into the forest floor. None of it made them happy. They could not forget the girl, the night, the dark hill, and her cry for her mother as she faded from this earth. The bugs needed to do something to try and make it right. They could not raise the dead or call to the girl's ghost, but they could return to her home and comfort her father, as best they could. They decided to visit at night, when the darkness would help mute their bodies between the shadows. They had been there many times, but after a gap in visits, the place felt new to them. It was a flat house atop a high hill with quiet trees and rocks. The winds were light, as if they wanted to wait to see what the insects might do. As the bugs crawled, they noticed the world start to change around them. It was becoming yellow, thick, as though the seasons were changing directly in front of them. There were stalks of gold plants towering over their squirmy bodies. The night sky spread apart like some sort of fantastical curtain, revealing a blinding summer day staring down at them. There was no sun, though. Just a stretched, cavernous chunk of light, which felt like it was pushing the earwigs even further into the ground. A hiss cut the air, along with a strange sound, and the image was gone. The dark house was back in front of them, standing silent against the gloom. Every fiber of their primal shell was screaming to run away, but they could not. Guilt has its own sense of gravity. When they crawled through the various cracks in the foundations and vents cut into the siding, they found a house that was seemingly deserted. The dog that was so furious with their initial appearance 2 weeks ago, which they swarmed, bit, and tore into submission, was gone completely. To be sure, they waited beneath the steps for its breaths and the clicking of its nails on the hardwood floor upstairs. They did not want the sole human living here to be alerted to their presence. After sitting still in the shadows, the earwigs decided to wander upstairs in slow darts and streaks. They didn't want to move in waves, like they had in the past when taking Aubrey or attacking the dog, but in slow, deliberate trails, like tar rising backwards out of some primordial pit. There weren't many sounds to make them skittish. A hum of a refrigerator, a few whistles of air-conditioned air gliding through ventilation, and the low voices of a television playing in the distance. As they moved throughout the house, they noticed that the only light was coming from the living room, where the man who lived there seemed to be at all moments. Aubrey's father hadn't gone to work in days, not since she vanished. He could not remember how long it had been. The mornings, afternoons, evenings, and nights were all meshed into one sweaty, alcohol-soaked stain beneath his body on the couch. Above him along the wall, he had punched holes with his right hand during more sober moments. The sheetrock looked like a honeycomb. There was blood and bits of skin tucked into the crushed material. Aubrey's father tried to focus on the reruns of MASH flashing on the television in the dark room. A large black tarp bristled against the nighttime air outside just behind the television. His dog, Ricky, shortly after Aubrey had disappeared, jumped through the window. Something had spooked the animal so badly it hadn't left the basement in weeks. Then, one day, he noticed the dark hole reflecting at him when he parked his car after a trip to the liquor store. He wandered the house looking for his dog. "Ricky! Ricky!" he yelled throughout the rooms. There was no reply, only the billowing trees beneath evening clouds. "Just another thing I love that left me," he said, before going inside and opening a bottle of vodka. This night he hadn't eaten anything to mute the alcohol controlling every vessel, vein, and capillary of his body. He had not walked any further than the bathroom in his own house. His daughter was gone. The last thing he'd done to her before she vanished was hit her. That was how she would remember him wherever she was. Before his wife died, before the bottles lined the shelves, boxes, and bookcases, he'd taken Aubrey fishing, read to her, and put her on his shoulders so she could smell the leaves of a tree. He had been kind at one point. He had been sweet. He knew it in the lost parts of his memory. He did. It didn't matter now, in this living emptiness. His depression was beyond a living thing. It was a weight tied around his waist that nobody else could see. It affected everything, but nobody noticed. Nobody cared. His wrist ached with a dull pain like it needed to be released. Maybe if he cut it open, it would help. His soul felt restless against his body, as if it didn't want to be tethered to this sack of soaked bones. An actual suicide required a lot of work. So instead he focused on falling deeper and deeper into the bottle, and eventually his body would be a sinking ship beneath waves of cheap liquor. The earwigs couldn't tell if the man was passed out completely. He was pale, with stained jeans and a flannel shirt that was worn up to his elbows. They didn't need to be human, though, to recognize that he wasn't far from oblivion. They pondered his still form so absorbed by the light and sour-smelling liquid. What could they do to make him happy? To spread some love in this home they'd been tricked into destroying? After a few moments, they knew. Maybe the man needed to feel like she was still here. Maybe he needed to believe his daughter was still alive. Perhaps that would lead him out of this personal abyss opening in his heart. They remembered where the hallway was, her bedroom, and how to get through the door when it was closed. They continued to move in strands so as not to be detected. They could feel something watching them from afar. It echoed of trees and water. The air stunk and followed them. There was a song, too. It seemed to rise out of the floor in delicate vibrations. They knew what was singing it. They couldn't worry about her right now. They had to focus on Aubrey's room. They were there in an instant. The inside of the bedroom was destroyed. Someone had gone through all the books, blankets, and pillows in some sort of bizarre frenzy, desperately searching. The bugs silently put everything back the way they remembered it. They straightened out the shelves, made the bed, and even fluffed the pillow. Then they turned on the light and closed the door in a heavy slam, just like Aubrey used to do. Aubrey's father was close to passing out when he heard a door slam down the hallway. He stirred up, nearly coughing on a lump of bile at the bottom of his throat. He was angry initially because he was so close to falling asleep, which meant being far away from this world. It had taken a few bottles to nearly forget he was alive, but the sound of Aubrey being home cut through his internal fog. He staggered to his feet and wobbled towards the lit-up door just down the hallway. He stopped, bent over, and puked on the floor. He would clean it up later. He wouldn't want Aubrey to step in it. The light around the edges of the door glowed warmly and familiarly. He wanted to tell her so many things about himself, her mother, and why he was drinking himself to despair. He wanted to tell her about how his father abused him, how he promised to never be like him, but when he lost her mother, the world seemed to crush all the kindness out of him. He wanted to apologize for hitting her, get help for his drinking, and simply just stare at his daughter and marvel that no matter what ills had befallen him, he still had this little piece of his heart walking around. Aubrey?" he said, while opening the door slowly. Nothing replied. It was just an empty room glowing beneath a round orange light. The air smelled stale. The window was closed. The place had been cleaned and organized, like Aubrey had just reappeared to straighten it out. Her father shook his head and looked down at the bed. He couldn't remember trashing it in one of his stupors, but he knew the room hadn't looked like this. "Whatever," he said, turning off the light and walking away. He was about to plant himself on the couch for another bottle when he heard the door shut behind him. The sound of the knob clicking made the world fall out around him. He felt alone, as though he were 1,000 miles away from the nearest human, though he lived in the heart of the suburbs. He jumped up and walked over to the bedroom. He took a moment to get his feet under him. The light was shining around the long and ominous rectangle. He opened the door again. It was just an empty space. He pulled the sheets off the bed, looked underneath it, and messed around with the desk. Still nothing. "What the fuck is happening?" he said, turning the light off and walking out. By the time he sat down, he heard it. The door closed. He scrambled up and burst through the bedroom. Nothing, except the things he disheveled just seconds earlier, had all been straightened out. Aubrey's father sat down on the bed and stared out the window. These events were sobering him by the second. He decided to sit there for a few minutes, waiting for whatever was happening to reappear. There was silence, except for a few moths batting against the window. The blankets he was sitting on still smelled like her. He rubbed his hand against them faintly, like she might be there beneath them. There were tears in his eyes. He didn't know where they came from. He waited, but nothing happened. He was feeling nauseated again. He didn't want to throw up in her room. He stood up and wandered to the bathroom. Just as he reached it, he heard the knob shut yet again, and he spun around, vomiting into the hallway. Something was haunting him. He rammed his shoulder into the door, smashing it off its hinges and shattering the frame into splinters. He tore up the bed, punched the desk, and ripped papers out of various books and magazines. He panted and snarled, lashing out at everything around him. "Where are you, Aubrey? Are you here?" he yelled. The earwigs would answer back if they could. They thought he would be happy to be reminded of her. They replicated her actions in the bedroom. They remembered her little rituals from all those lonely nights when they had visited her. As the man calmed down and wandered back to his couch, they quickly repaired the room he had just destroyed in silent crawls of their beady bodies. They started to close the door like they had done many times before, but as the line of darkness along its edge seemed to flatten, the man came bursting through it. He flicked on the light and caught the bugs clustered throughout the room. They were on the bed, desk, carpet, walls, ceiling, and window. They were everywhere. They paused and looked at him. You again," he screamed. The earwigs quickly scattered in every direction. The man dashed out into the night, toward his garage. His stomps and grunts made the earwigs flee toward the basement and out the way they'd squirmed in. They were done here. They knew he was on the edge. They could sense the shadows circling his back and chest. He was already dead. His body just needed to get there. There was nothing more they could do to ease his pain. Aubrey's father eventually returned to the room with 2 bright red gasoline cans in hand. He doused her bedroom, the hallway, living room, the rest of his house, and himself with the sour liquid. He laughed, cried, and mumbled between splashes of the liquid. He stopped a second before lighting a match from a dusty box he'd kept atop the refrigerator. Death was the only way out of this pain. His depression was a maze. Each turn inside his soul led to another memory of the people that were gone from his life. How could he live with all that past happiness when the horror of the present outweighed it? How could he have memories of beauty, while the ugliness of his current world illuminated the inequity of his own existence? He didn't have an answer. So he struck the match, and the last thing he remembered was the smell of his skin cooking and the stickiness of the kitchen floor. The earwigs watched the house burn from afar. It didn't take long for the flames to fold around the siding, roof, and walls. It was as though a crimson flower had risen out of the earth to devour the building whole. The bugs were done with Aubrey and her father. No human would know what really happened in this house on the hill. They wouldn't know about the drinking, the bullying, the bridge, the prairie, and the emptiness. All that would be left would be charred walls and mounds of debris. For the insects, the affairs of humans were too complex and painful to be around for any length of time. Life in their forest, even in the proximity of a monster, was much better than these endeavors. They crawled home in long trails. A few people out on the street who were gawking at the smoke and fire noticed them, but didn't say anything. Just pointed with jaws hanging. Perversely, the earwigs wanted to dash over to them and crawl over their bodies like speed bumps, but they resisted this urge. They were frustrated, hurt, and tired of trying to understand things. They just wanted to go home. It was imperative. The trip there took longer. At times it felt like they were stuck in some sort of dark tunnel of cloudy asphalt, still trees and moon-edged sky. The same scene kept repeating all around them, over and over again. One street would end and then rise up again in a long, dark tongue of man-made rock. The air was sweet-smelling but stagnant, as if not even the air changed around them. Cracks along the curb and blades of grass repeated. Instead of hearing wind, crickets, or even a distant car bellow by, there was a hint of music from somewhere. It was a strange melody, but familiar. Then, the forest appeared directly in front of their thousands of eyes, as if it had always been there. They were happy to be home. They broke into a long wave over the curb and through the lawn towards the trees. Something odorous filled the air. It was acrid, stinging, a boiling scent hanging between every molecule floating around them. Strange plants had sprouted up around the forest's edge. They were a few feet tall with diamond-round leaves with bright red buds in their center. They were so thick and plentiful, there wasn't even a single inch to dash through for their tiny bodies. The earwigs looked for other avenues inside, but more plants sprouted up at every turn. There was no end to their wall. It seemed to follow them everywhere they desired. It was her. They knew it was her. And this wasn't their home anymore. This episode was dedicated in loving memory to Carl Meek, Jeremy Reichort, Steve Paulson, and Steve Polisko. Don't just ask your friends how they are. Ask them if they're okay. And feel free to challenge them if they say good or yes to either of those questions. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The stories Snare and Mouse in the Stormhouse, written by Robert Dawn. Laurus Nobilis by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.